Well, good morning. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's informational webinar on the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency's 2022 Coordinated Community Violence Intervention Strategies Pilot Grant Program. My name is Sam Cook, and I serve as Senior Project Manager here at PCCD, and I'm also joined today by several other PCCD team members who will be supporting today's webinar, including folks from our executive program and fiscal staff. So I'll let them introduce themselves briefly at this time. Chris, you want to go ahead and kick us off?
Morning, everyone. I'm Chris Applicants, Deputy Director for Office of Financial Management and Administration.
Good morning. I'm Heather Hewitt, and I'm an Administrative Officer in our Executive Office.
Hi, I'm Alyssa Subsinski. I'm a Project Coordinator at PCCD. I think that's all of us, so back to you, Sam.
Great. Thanks so much, and thanks, everyone. All right, so first up, just a few housekeeping rules and some reminders. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our gun violence webpage as soon as it becomes available. We do encourage you to check your audio settings to make sure you're able to hear today's presentation using your computer or other device. Please note that we cannot hear you on this Microsoft Teams live platform. However, you will be able to submit questions through the Q&A feature in the live event. And rest assured that even though the questions that you submit through that feature will not be visible to all participants, it will be reviewed and received by our staff. We are going to allot about 15 minutes at the end of today's webinar to answer any questions that have been submitted by participants through the Q&A feature. To the extent possible, any questions that we're not able to address fully in today's webinar will be answered in writing on the Q&A section of our website. And just a final note that a copy of PowerPoint slides from today's session will be posted on PCCD's website. So you don't have to worry about furiously scribbling down your notes. We will provide you with a written copy after the fact. So moving towards the rest of our agenda for today, we're going to provide a very brief overview of PCCD, and then we'll get to the 2022 Coordinated Community Violence Intervention Strategies funding opportunity that was recently announced by PCCD, including some information about the grant program's goals, eligible applicants and activities, and funding priorities. We'll also go through some of the process and timeline for requesting funds through this grant program, including walking through some steps that applicants will need to take in order to develop and submit a proposal using our eGrant system. And finally, as we noted previously, we are going to reserve about 15 minutes or so at the end of the webinar just to answer any questions. Please feel free to submit those as they come to you. And then without further ado, we'll just go ahead and dive right in. So first up, a little bit about PCCD. For those of you who may be less familiar with our agency, we wanted to give you a quick overview of the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, or PCCD, as we are more commonly known. Our agency was established in 1978 through Pennsylvania state law, and we serve as the Commonwealth's Justice Planning and Policymaking Agency. Our mission is to enhance the quality, coordination, and planning within the criminal and juvenile justice systems to facilitate the delivery of services to victims of crime and also to increase the safety of our communities. We're a relatively small but growing state agency housed within the executive office with approximately 100 employees or so working across 4 offices. And we are directed by an overarching commission board that is advised by 7 different advisory committees and 2 training boards. So as you can see on this slide, our responsibilities as an agency and our programming fall into a number of different areas, including funding and grants, technical assistance, data and research, victims compensation, and training, among other responsibilities. So if you're interested in learning more about these areas, I highly encourage you to check out our website at www.pccd.pa.gov. So we're here today to talk about the Coordinated Community Violence Intervention Strategies pilot program. And I just wanted to note that one of our top strategic priorities as an agency is providing support for effective community-led gun violence prevention efforts. We are also a longtime investor in strategies that increase effectiveness of interagency planning and collaboration focused on preventing crime and increasing public safety. So in recent years, our agency has made investments to support local community violence intervention strategies using available state and federal resources that are aligned with recommendations identified by the Special Counsel on Gun Violence and responsive to the needs of local communities. You can learn more about our past and current investments in these efforts via the Violence Intervention and Prevention Prevention, or VIP, and gun violence reduction grant programs, among other initiatives, by visiting our gun violence webpage, which is housed under the Criminal Justice tab of our website. And we certainly encourage you to check out the interactive gun violence and VIP grantees data dashboard and some archive program pages online, where you can check out some of the projects that we've been able to support in recent years. So now that you know a little bit more about who we are, let's move toward the grant program that you're all interested in learning more about today, and that's the 2022 Coordinated CVI Strategies Pilot Grants Solicitation. So first, just a bit of background. On July 8th, the state budget passed into law, which allocated, among other things, a total of $105 million in state and federal funds to PCCD for violence intervention and prevention grants, as well as technical assistance. So in response to these new resources, PCCD staff and members of the School Safety and Security Committee, which is responsible for overseeing the administration of VIP funding, developed and adopted a VIP solicitation framework utilizing a multi-pronged approach to the administration of these new dollars. So that plan, which was approved by the committee in late August, involved using a portion, $15 million, of the total appropriation for 2022 Coordinated CVI Strategies Pilot Grants. This is a new initiative for our agency, and it will support between 5 to 8 pilot sites in designing and deploying short, mid, and long-term community violence prevention and response strategies within focused service areas, what we're defining as contiguous geographic areas. As the program's title suggests, these grants will pilot coordinated community violence intervention strategies. And for those of you who may be less familiar with the term, community violence intervention, or CVI, is an approach that uses multidisciplinary evidence-informed strategies to reduce violence through tailored and community-centered initiatives. CVI strategies engage individuals and groups to prevent and disrupt cycles of violence and retaliation, and also work to build and enhance relationships between members of the community and community resources to increase access to and use of services and supports that can help save lives, address trauma, offer opportunity, and improve the conditions that can drive violence. Those can include physical, environmental, social, economic, etc., all of those factors and conditions. More information about CVI is available on pages 4 through 5 of the CCVI Strategies funding announcement. And you can also check out more on the U.S. Department of Justice's CVI initiative website, among other resources. Under that relatively broad umbrella of CVI approaches, these grants are designed to support a wide range of programs and activities that can address community violence and are aligned with allowable uses of funding as articulated in the PA Public School Code. We'll get to the details on some of those eligible activities a little later in our presentation. There are also some specific requirements and parameters outlined in the CCVI Strategies funding announcement that we will cover in depth as well. Of course, we're here today to talk about the Coordinated CVI Strategies Grant Program, but we also wanted to note before we got too much further along that this funding announcement is part of a broader set of funding opportunities recently announced by PCCD related to community violence intervention and gun violence prevention. So that includes a new $50 million grants program designed to support investigation and prosecution of gun-related crimes and violence. District attorneys, local law enforcement agencies, and other eligible entities are eligible to apply under that solicitation. In addition, PCCD recently announced availability of $135 million in local law enforcement support grants, which can be used for a number of activities and purposes. And lastly, a portion of this year's VIP appropriation is being used to support an $85.5 million VIP competitive grants program funding announcement, which supports a wide range of programs and activities addressing community violence and prevention efforts. So we'd encourage you to check out our open funding announcements webpage and eGrants for more information about these solicitations. There are also alerts at the very top of our homepage that will direct you to all 3 of these funding announcements if you feel like taking a shortcut. Eligible applicants are very strongly urged to carefully review all available funding announcements and determine which opportunity or opportunities may be best for your specific organization or agency based on eligibility criteria, funding priorities, and other information as articulated in those funding announcements. So Getting back to the coordinated CVI strategies funding announcement, for purposes of this solicitation, eligible applicants include the entities listed on this slide. So that includes community-based or nonprofit organizations who have 501c3 status, institutions of higher education, municipalities, counties, and district attorneys' offices. A couple of additional details and considerations regarding eligibility before we proceed. First, community-based and nonprofit organizations must be registered as a 501c3 in order to make direct application for funds. We will ask you for documentation of this status in e-grants if applicable. And you'll also be required to complete a nonprofit agency checklist if you are an applicant who falls under that category. Moving a little further along the list, institutions of higher education are also eligible to apply for coordinated CVI funds. For purposes of this solicitation, we are defining institutions of higher education to include any and all entities found within the Pennsylvania School Code's definition, and that can include a community college, university within the state system of higher education, the Pennsylvania State University, University of Pittsburgh, Temple University, Lincoln University, any other state-related institution designated in the Commonwealth, as well as any accredited private or independent college and university and any private licensed school. So in addition to institutions of higher education, we are also opening up this funding announcement to municipalities and counties who can come in for CCVI strategies funding. And finally, district attorneys' offices are also eligible to submit an application under this funding announcement. It is worth noting, however, that the applicant agency for district attorneys' offices needs to be the county, or in some cases, the county chief executive or city treasurer, which is kind of standard procedure for our e-grants applications at PCCD. And last but certainly not least, just a note that for-profit businesses and organizations are not considered to be eligible applicants under this funding announcement. And again, the CCVI strategies funding announcement provides a lot of important information regarding applicant eligibility and application procedures. And so we do encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to carefully review that document before you make an application. So as we mentioned earlier, the primary purpose of the CCVI Strategies pilot grant program is to increase local coordination and collaboration to more effectively prevent, intervene, and respond to gun and group-related violence. And so ultimately, the goal of these pilots would be to reduce rates of gun violence and other violent crime in highest risk communities. And so this program is designed to provide intensive investments and supports for community violence intervention strategies that are deployed within focused service areas, what we're defining as contiguous geographic areas. So at a high level, the grant program is structured to accomplish several key objectives. The first is to support, as we mentioned before, 5 to 8 pilot projects over a 32-month period. We'll pilot and evaluate the effectiveness of strategies that are deployed by local communities through these pilots, including law enforcement related programs, community-based programs, and school-based programs as applicable. Improving coordination and linkages among community-based groups, law enforcement, social services, justice practitioners, victim services, public health, education, and other key stakeholders is another objective of this funding announcement. And we also aim to increase capacity of local communities to support evidence-based prevention, intervention, and response strategies, as well as ultimately improving access to services, resources, and supports for people and communities who have been impacted by gun violence. So under this funding announcement, eligible applicants can request any amount up to and including $3 million. Applicants are strongly encouraged to only apply for the amount of funding needed to support project planning and implementation activities and in line with the size of your proposed service area. The proposals will be scored in part on the reasonableness of your proposed budget, in addition with other criteria that's described in the written funding announcement. Worth noting that funding under this solicitation can support implementation of new projects, as well as the expansion or enhancement of existing collaborative initiatives and programs. And just wanted to make another note that these funds should not be used purely for continuation of existing programs, but again, can support expansion or enhancement of those existing initiatives. Applicants are going to need to describe and demonstrate their ability to meet several key deliverables under this funding announcement. First, projects must have a lead agency or organization responsible for spearheading the collaborative project. this lead agency or organization should be the one that is submitting the application. So if you are the applicant, our assumption is that you are serving in that lead agency or organization role. And the second key deliverable is that the lead agency and organization is going to be responsible for recruiting, hiring, and onboarding a full-time coordinator position to oversee day-to-day operations of the project, including facilitating communication and tracking progress with and among key partners. Under this solicitation, applicants need to demonstrate that they have a comprehensive plan or need to include a planning period within their application in order to apply for funds. If one hasn't already been completed, projects need to conduct an inventory or assessment of available services, resources, and programs currently available in the proposed service area, as well as identify any gaps that may exist in that community. Using that assessment, projects will develop or implement a community safety plan or similar action plan that identifies 2 to 3 strategies for funding that are aligned with evidence-based CVI strategies and responsive to local needs and priorities. So what do we mean when we say evidence-informed CVI or anti-violence strategies? So the funding announcement document provides some examples of common elements that are typically embedded in CVI approaches, such as trusted, credible messengers, partnerships with community members, trauma-informed and trauma-responsive practices, and a commitment to racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic equity, among other key principles. PCCD has also used the categorization of anti-violence strategies shown here on this slide to think about the types of intervention, prevention, and transformation strategies that our agency invests in. And this may look familiar. It is adapted from the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform and certainly echoes some tiered classifications for violence reduction strategies that are broadly employed by public health. So those include in the intervention or short-term category, strategies addressing violence that is happening right now within a given community. These often focus on interruption and intervention of violence, as well as addressing the immediate impacts, what we would kind of label as crisis response. This usually involves targeting efforts to specific people and groups who are most likely to have violence involvement, whether as victims, perpetrators, or both. And you can generally expect to see results from these efforts germinate within 1 to 3 years. Moving to the medium term in the prevention category, these are types of strategies that tend to focus on addressing factors that put youth and others at risk of future violence involvement. And some examples of programs that we've supported at PCCD and that fall into this category include programming ranging from mentoring, wraparound supports and services, diversion programs, reentry services, after-school programs, trauma-informed care, upstream prevention programs, and the list continues. And finally, in an important category, but one that takes a little bit longer to see results from, it is called transformation. So those are our long-term investments. So these are strategies that really have a goal of transforming communities so they are no longer prone to violence. These investments focus on addressing long-term impacts and community-wide improvements and can include things like neighborhood revitalization, education and youth development, workforce development, etc. So again, these are, I think, some good examples and some parameters around what we mean when we talk about evidence-informed. I should also note that when we talk about CVI strategies being evidence-informed, we are also referring to the principle that CVI strategies should be built and designed using evidence generated by multiple disciplines and a variety of methods. So you can see on page 4 of the written funding announcement that evidence used to support a CVI program may include findings from research and evaluation, as well as things like case studies, expert opinions, or documented lessons learned from the field. We are also committed at PCCD to engaging in research and evaluation to help further build the CVI evidence base for what works. So to that end, all selected pilot projects will be part of an evaluation initiative that is supported by PCCD and an identified research and evaluation partner. So in addition to the CVI and anti-violence approaches we just covered, grants and technical assistance supported with VIP funds, including the CCVI strategies pilot grants, must align with the list of eligible activities included in section 1306, subsection B, J, subsection 22, that's a mouthful, of the PA Public School Code. And you can see those are listed here on this slide for reference and are certainly also available in the written funding announcement document. It's important to remember that as we kind of throw a bunch of lists at you of programs, approaches, and models, those are really designed for reference purposes only. So programs that are not specifically identified in these examples can still certainly be presented to PCCD for consideration. And regardless of the strategies that you select, applicants need to be able to demonstrate why the strategy was selected for the target area or target populations and provide some evidence backing up or indicating that the strategy is likely to reduce violence in the short, medium, or long term. So community-centered full partnerships are really a cornerstone principle of CVI approaches. And under this solicitation, applicants need to demonstrate partnerships and working relationships with a wide range of community stakeholders. These required partners include, where appropriate, local law enforcement and justice-related stakeholders, for instance, police, district attorneys' offices, public defenders' offices, courts, probation, parole, etc., victim service providers, folks in the education sector, community and economic development, workforce development, health and human services, the arts, recreation, and public spaces, faith-based organizations, youth-serving organizations, and other community-based groups that are instrumental to preventing or responding to violence within a given service area. Applicants should include relevant letters of support from these partners and should also provide documentation of cross-sector coordination. This can include a memorandum of understanding or MOU or a comprehensive plan to work with multidisciplinary partners to reduce violence. Just a note on sort of the partnership requirement to clarify a bit. Partners demonstrating commitment to the project should be involved in the initial planning and assessment phase. So obviously, depending on the results of the assessment, these entities may or may not be part of the programmatic or implementation activities that you are seeking funding to support. In addition, entities that serve multiple roles, for instance, a youth-serving recreation organization or a community-based arts group, could certainly fulfill multiple required partnership roles under the solicitation. The individuals who are representing partner entities should reflect the scope of the project's proposed service area. For example, a chief of police would likely need to sign a letter of support if a project is going to focus on an entire jurisdiction, whereas a district captain of a police department could indicate support for projects that are focused on a smaller area, such as neighborhoods or wards. And ultimately, the goal of these partnership requirements is to ensure that community violence prevention and intervention strategies supported through our pilot grants are identified and deployed with necessary buy-in and resourcing from key stakeholders within a given community. So we've covered who can apply for funding and what activities and approaches grant dollars can support. Just to reiterate, a total of $15 million in state and federal VIP funds is being announced to support this initiative. So eligible applicants, as we mentioned before, can request up to $3 million total for project periods that span up to 32 months for a project period of February 1st, 2023 through September 30th of 2025. So as noted on this slide, this solicitation does require a 25% match, either in cash or through in-kind supports. And just a couple other items of note. First, any entities that have previously received or are about to receive PCCD funding of any kind are eligible to apply for this solicitation. There is no restriction for entities that have funding from other sources as well, but just a note that you will be asked to describe in your application, if you have received funding from us, the way that those programs are going and how this particular initiative builds on those previous efforts. And just to note that your response to this question may be taken into consideration during that review process. And second, as this is a highly competitive application process, eligible applicants should only submit one request each under this funding announcement. And finally, just a note again that applicants do not have to come in for that full budget amount. It's just a maximum So we certainly, again, encourage folks to only request what is absolutely necessary if they can. A couple other notes and disclaimers, footnotes, if you will. PCCD is not liable for any costs that would be incurred prior to that official start date of the award, so February 1st, 2023. And in addition, funding needs to be used to supplement, not supplant, existing funding and resources. So we mentioned that this funding announcement requires a funding match, and that's because we recognize at PCCD that the need for long-term system-wide responses to prevent and address root causes of violence in communities. And so we felt that requiring proposed projects funded under CCVI strategies, pilot solicitations, providing at least 25% in match funding really would help ensure that there is meaningful buy-in and longer-term resources available to support these efforts. We mentioned that the 25% match can be either cash, in kind, or a combination of both. And this slide sort of shows some examples of what we mean when we talk about those terms. So the first kind of match is a cash match, which is sometimes referred to as a hard match. So as the name suggests, a cash match would include income or cash contributions from a source or sources other than grant funds that's budgeted for the proposed projects. So examples of these can include, but certainly aren't limited to, donations, other local, state, or federal government grants or appropriations, just with the caveat that PCCD would not consider our grant funding to suffice for a cash match purpose. It can include foundation grants, corporate donations or contributions. The list goes on. The second type of match source is an in-kind match, which is also known as a soft match. So these in-kind matches are considered to be non-cash contributions of value, resources, or materials that are provided by an applicant or somebody else. So that can include project partners. And some examples of these sources can include things like donated office supplies, equipment, professional services, volunteer time, among others. An in-kind match is typically the calculated value of personnel, goods, and services, and can include both direct and indirect costs. And in general, the value of in-kind match sources and contributions should be determined by fair market value. So regardless of which type of match you use, grantees receiving funding through the CCVI Strategies Pilot Grant Program will be expected to maintain documentation to back up all match supports that are claimed. And you can learn more detailed information regarding this requirement on pages 8 through 9 of the written funding announcement document. So moving from our match requirement, let's get into what activities and expenses can be supported with grant funding. So funding can support expenses associated with direct project activities and program implementation, and that can include, but are not limited to, salaries and benefits for personnel, full or part-time. That can include overtime, contractors, consultants, facilitation of referrals to community-based service providers and programs, and that can include incentives or stipends for participants, supplies and equipment, training, technical assistance, travel and transportation expenses, including vehicle leases. And you can also budget for indirect costs that don't exceed federally approved rates or a de minimis rate of 10%. And certainly any other activities that are necessary to meet the needs of programs and participants. So that's what you can spend money on. Now let's talk about the types of activities and expenses that these grant funds cannot support. In general, physical security and infrastructure costs, such as security cameras, building modifications, other hardening strategies, are not eligible under this solicitation. But noted on this slide, you can use the funding under this solicitation to request support for expenses related to crime prevention through environmental design, such as greening, cleanup, lighting, etc. In addition, grant funds may not be used for construction, land acquisition, lobbying or political contributions, honorary or bonuses, or vehicle purchases. So again, you can lease vehicles, but you can't purchase a vehicle. And again, PCCD would reserve the right to have approved applicants remove or reduce items from the proposed budget that are either deemed ineligible or not sufficiently related to the project. And we do have approval of all final budgets. So just a couple of things to consider before we get into the application process. As you develop your applications and prepare things like project budgets and work plans, we just wanted you to be mindful of a couple of additional grant requirements. So under this grant program, selected grantees will be asked to attend virtual onboarding meetings and other orientation activities as prescribed by PCCD and our technical assistance partners. And in addition, as I mentioned before, each project is going to be part of an evaluation process that is designed to capture site-specific and pilot-wide outcomes. So more detail to come, but grantees essentially will be expected to provide quarterly performance data as part of their program reports, as well as any other information that might be needed to facilitate this evaluation. It's worth noting that whoever PCCD selects as an evaluation partner will be asked to cover costs associated with direct participation in these required evaluation activities. And in addition, applicants are able to include costs related to data collection within their proposed project budgets. Our agency generally recommends accounting for between 5 to 10 hours for required orientation and onboarding activities, in addition to any other staff or people time that you would need for your project to successfully manage a grant award. So let's get into the application process, shall we? So eligible organizations should submit an application for CCVI strategies, pilot grants funding using PCCD's e-grant system. Those grant applications are due by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, October 31st, 2022. So happy Halloween. Review, scoring, and recommendations of projects will be made following the receipt and review of applications in e-grants. So just want to sort of say that speaking of e-grants, which is everyone's favorite grant management system, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Heather Hewitt, who's going to provide some information about how to get started in that system and some tips as you navigate creating and submitting an application. So Heather, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sam. Good morning, everybody. The first step in the e-grants registration process is to complete the agency registration form if your agency is not already registered in eGrants, obviously. And that link, you can see there's a link to the Getting Started in eGrants webpage, which is on PCCD's website. And all of these forms and guides that we're going to discuss here briefly are on the website. So once the agency is registered in eGrants, your next step is to register yourself if you're not already, and then you will need to request roles in eGrants to make sure that you have the correct permissions to move forward with your grant. Sam, next slide. So again, the agency registration request form is on our website. It just kind of shows you how you can get there. And once these registration forms are completed, they can be returned to our resource account, ra-egrantsupport@pa.gov, which is also listed on the form. Once that's in, you'll receive a notification email from the help desk with some next steps. Next slide. So these are the user roles that were mentioned as far as security roles for your application process. So the access to the agency grants are separated into 6 roles: a financial creator, financial reader, program creator, program reader, submission, and a user manager. The main roles that you would want to have if you're going to be doing a bulk of the application are the financial creator and the program creator roles, as well as the submission role. These creator roles will allow you to view and create fiscal and program information, manage program reports, budget section information, fiscal reports, all that good stuff. The reader roles are just that, they're read-only roles. So if you have maybe a higher up that needs to just review the work before it's submitted, this could be a role for them. And then the submission role is just what it is in order to submit your forms, applications, modifications, etc. Next slide. And do note that every agency has to register 2 users in order to complete their application. Next slide. And the user manager, the agency user manager role, they will approve requests and maintain existing security for users that are already established with the agency. Every agency, we do want every agency to have a user manager. So on that role request form that you can pull up on our website, there is a checkbox for a user manager. And I will also say whoever sends in the agency registration form is going to ask for user manager information on that as well. So that person would be granted the user manager and the other roles as well. We do have a user manager help guide on our website that will walk you through what the user manager is able to do and how to do it. Next slide. So if you need any help while you're working on the eGrants registration process, we do have the eGrants help desk, which is available by email or phone call, and we are available Monday through Friday from 8 to 4. And then as you see on the screen, there are some other resources to help you get started. We do have some walkthrough guides on our website. And again, if anybody needs anything, don't hesitate to call the help desk. And I think I am now turning it over to Chris.
Yep, actually me, real quick.
Oh, sorry, Sam.
That's okay.
Back to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. So we wanted to take just a couple of moments to review what's included in the CCVI Strategies Pilot Grants application. Once you get into eGrants and have all of those roles established, as Heather just walked you through. So as a reminder, please review carefully the written funding announcement document before you start your eGrants application. It will make your life a whole lot easier. The eGrants application is structured in 8 major sections, which we're going to walk through in the next couple of slides. So the first section is the executive summary, which if you've applied with funding from us before, will look very familiar. Applicants should provide a very brief synopsis of your proposed project using the script and template language that's provided in that eGrants section. The next section of the application is the applicant overview section. This one asks for information about the organization that's making application, including their capacity and experience in coordinating CVI efforts. Applicants should also, in this section, describe the project leads coordinator role, including their plans to recruit, hire, and onboard that required position within the first quarter of grant activities, along with any other roles or individuals that will be hired, contracted, paid, etc., to support project activities. So finally, this section also asks applicants to identify the people and organizations who are going to serve as project partners supporting planning and/or implementation efforts. And just a reminder to provide those letters of support or commitment or other documentation that those folks are aware of being named in your request and are willing to partner with you all on that proposed project. The third section focuses on the proposed project's target area and population or populations. So applicants should use this section to describe where project activities will primarily take place, including why this specific location or geographic area was chosen as the focal point for coordinated CVI strategies. So importantly, applicants need to describe their history working with and within this particular community. And applicants should also identify and describe the project's targeted populations, including how the applicant identified or will work to identify this population and reach individuals and their family members who are at highest risk of violence involvement. Applicants should also describe any currently known needs in the community, including why coordinated approaches to violence prevention and intervention are needed. Moving right along, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, all applicants under this funding announcement need to demonstrate that they have a comprehensive plan or must include a planning period within their application in order to apply for funds. So in the project description section of the eGrants application, applicants need to describe whether or not planning activities have occurred with project partners to date, or if this will take place in the early phase of the project period. So just a note that planning costs may not exceed 5% of your total project budget and should also not exceed 9 months of the proposed project timeframe. Applicants should also use this section to address how they are going to leverage grant funding to enhance coordination of violence prevention and intervention efforts, including minimizing duplication of services within the community. Further information provided in this section really depends on whether the applicant is requesting funds to implement a previously developed or identified community safety plan or coordinated CVI partnerships, or if the applicant is requesting funds for a new initiative and needs a planning and assessment period. So you should respond to the question prompt in this section that best fits your proposed project. And further in the project description section, applicants are asked to describe their plan for hiring, onboarding, and training key project personnel. If your organization has previously received PCCD funding to support gun violence reduction or violence intervention efforts, you need to also articulate the impact of those initiatives and again, distinguish how proposed activities would differ from or build upon and expand those previously funded projects. And finally, a reminder that all applicants under the solicitation have to develop and attach a short one-page project work plan that identifies the project's goals and objectives and identifies the specific activities that'll take place at each stage of the project. So this plan should identify who will be responsible for completing those activities, whether that's staff or partners, and the start and end dates for each activity. So the fifth section of the application is the budget detail. Applicants should include an up to 32-month comprehensive budget that addresses key deliverables and activities of the project. So as we've mentioned previously, applicants may request funding to support new coordinated initiatives, including planning and needs assessment efforts that will inform what CVI strategies will be deployed using grant funds. So applicants who are seeking funding to support new initiatives where a needs assessment or plan has not already been conducted should provide a detailed budget for all costs associated with planning and initial coordination, as well as placeholder estimates for the types of expenses they anticipate needing grant funds to support in the project's implementation phase. We'll work closely here at PCCD with selected projects who fall into this category upon initial approval and onboarding to ensure that budgets meet necessary PCCD criteria. And in addition, all grantees meeting this criteria are going to be asked to submit final, what we're calling implementation budgets following the conclusion of the planning and assessment period. So the budget detail must also include a description of how the 25% match requirement will be met. Again, either cash or in kind or both. Applicants will be required to enter line items in their budget detail, calculating the amount and sources of match funding. And please note, if you are using an in-kind match, you should clearly label that in the budget detail and any other relevant application sections as appropriate. I'm going to pause real quick and see if my colleague Chris has anything else that he would like to add on the budget detail section, tips, tricks, pearls of wisdom that will help you all as you're thinking through that section.
Thanks, Sam. No, I just to reiterate that the budget detail section does require you to enter line items, and we'll be looking for that each cost is entered as a separate line item, and eGrants will require you to enter calculations for each line item. So just a note to think about that before you get to that budget detail section in your application.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
All right, so next up is required attachments. So under the solicitation, applicants need to include a couple of documents within the required attachments section in eGrants. So those include resumes or CVs for any key personnel, a position description or summary of key responsibilities for the required full-time coordinator role, a project work plan, as we mentioned before, letters of support and commitment or similar documentation like MOUs for all named project partners. If applicable, you should also upload and attach a copy of the recently completed community-based needs assessment, safety plan, strategic plan, whatever else documents the community level needs and proposed strategies to prevent and address violence. And then again, if applicable and you are a nonprofit, you should also use this section to attach evidence of nonprofit status, for example, your IRS 501c3 determination letter. So as we head towards wrap up and our Q&A portion of today's webinar, let's talk a little bit about timelines. So we are anticipating an application review and recommendation award timeline that spans from early September through mid-January, with again those projects slated to begin February 1st of next year. So as you can see on this slide, and this is also available in the written funding announcement, the funding announcement did open up in eGrants on September 6th. We obviously are here today on September 15th with today's webinar for interested applicants. The deadline for submitting any written questions that you may have to our resource account is going to be October 27th, which I believe is the Thursday before the funding announcement closes. So we will post responses to that prior to the deadline. And then again, that final deadline for getting your applications submitted in is Monday, October 31st by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Please don't wait until midnight. You will not be able to submit. Anticipated date for selection. We will let you know sometime in January, likely mid to late January, if you've been approved by the School Safety and Security Committee. And again, the anticipated grant start date would be February 1st. We've talked about the timeline. Again, 32 months from start to finish is the project period for these grants. So if you have any questions about the funding announcement or the application process, we certainly encourage you to ask them, and you can do that in a couple of ways. Today's informational webinar is a great opportunity to ask for clarification on anything we've covered that you want more detail on. You can submit your questions for our team using the Q&A feature in the Teams platform. And again, we'll get to as many of those as we can in the upcoming Q&A portion of our webinar. I see a couple of questions have already come through. Please feel free to ask anything else that you may be curious about at this stage using that. You can also email questions to our staff using our executive office resource account at ra-pccd_executiveofc@pa.gov. Any questions that we received during today's webinar or via email will be answered, and all Q&As will be posted on PCCD's website for everybody to see and benefit from. We encourage you to consider checking the online funding announcement Q&A webpage before you ask a question. It is entirely possible that we might have already answered it for somebody else. And in addition, we also encourage applicants to read the online Q&A page for the CCVI funding announcement before submitting your application. Just as a last check, it is possible that somebody else asked a question that you did not know that you needed the answer to. With that said, I'd like to now turn things over to my colleague Chris to provide an overview of some steps that will be important as part of the application process, as well as some things to consider in terms of PCCD's grant process overall. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sam. One of the first things to consider, what you're looking at is the first page of our applicant readiness checklist. Our applicant readiness checklist is a tool we designed to help organizations prepare to receive grant funding from PCCD, as well as to gauge whether they are ready to be a direct PCCD grant recipient. The checklist contains items required to receive grant funding, as well as items that we consider to be best practices for managing grant funds. This multi-page checklist is a useful tool for all agencies, public and private, but is especially helpful for nonprofit entities to ensure that they have sufficient capacity and established internal controls to successfully implement a project funded with federal or state grant resources. The full interactive checklist is currently available on our website on the applicant resources page of the funding announcement section, and we encourage all potential applicants to review this checklist prior to submitting an application. Few other steps, important steps to prepare for submitting an application. First one is, once your organization has decided to apply for CCVI funding, there are a few important steps that your agency must take in order to make application and eventually receive funding. This first step would be to register your agency and users in PCCD's e-grant system, as Heather described in detail previously. Your organization will also need to register as a non-procurement vendor in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's vendor management system. Every organization that receives grant funding from any Commonwealth agency is required to have a non-procurement vendor number. PCCD makes grant payments via ACH transfer to your designated bank account. So as part of the vendor registration process, you will want to establish your organization's banking details within your vendor record. And finally, in order to receive this grant funding, your organization will be required to have an active registration in the Federal System for Award Management, also known as SAM. The SAM system collects organizational information on all entities receiving federal funding, and registration in the system is required. In order to register in the SAM system, your organization must also have a unique entity identifier, or UEI. This is an entity-specific federal identification number which replaced the DUNS number. For more information regarding SAM registration, you can go to sam.gov, which is the federal government's website, where you would register for SAM. And information regarding the UEI and transition from the DUNS number can be found at fsd.gov. In addition, information and resources on all of these topics can be found in the funding announcement document and are also available on our website at pccd.pa.gov. I think that's it for this section. Sam, I think I'll turn it back over to you for the Q&A portion.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
All right, everyone. We are in the home stretch. So with that, we'd like to open up officially for questions from you all. Please, again, use that Q&A feature to submit your questions if you haven't done so already. We are monitoring incoming questions and we'll answer as many as we can over the next several minutes. And again, a reminder, if there are any questions that we aren't able to get to or that we can't fully address during today's session, we will be reviewing those and publishing written answers and responses to the extent possible on our Q&A section of our funding announcement Q&A website. So just a friendly reminder, disclaimer, if you will, that due to the very competitive nature of this solicitation, our staff will not be able to answer questions related to how a group should specifically answer application questions. And we also won't be able to provide input on whether specific models, programs, or activities would be considered eligible. So with all those disclaimers and encouragements aside, I will turn things over to my colleague, Alyssa, who will start us off with our first participant question. Alyssa?
Hi, everyone. So we do have a couple of really great questions. So we'll start off with a little bit about the match that's required. So can federal dollars that are non-PCCD related be used towards the 25% match?
Chris, do you want to take that one?
Yep.
Yep.
Yes, federal dollars, non-PCCD federal dollars can be used towards the 25% match requirement.
Okay. And then somebody else is asking, does PCCD prefer large groups that assist people broadly or more of a targeted program?
Yeah, I think so. There's no restriction or expectation that's articulated in the funding announcement regarding sort of the number of individuals that you have to serve. So there's nothing that sort of dictates that a particular community or geographic area needs to reach a certain population size, for instance. So what I would say is if your organization is reviewing the funding announcement, just again, be sure to explain within the application kind of why that service area was selected, who is in that service area, what the community needs, and again, just make your best case from that perspective. But no, there's no minimum or maximum in terms of how many folks we expect applicants to reach.
All right, perfect. And then we have another question. If we are a newly formed nonprofit, is this the kind of grant that we could apply for?
Sam,
Chris,
I'll take that one. I mean, if you have the capacity, if you meet the applicant requirements, you certainly can apply. I would encourage you to review the applicant readiness checklist and make sure you have all those controls and required documents and other items in place prior to making application.
Yeah, and I'll just say from a programmatic perspective in the funding announcement, you may recall when we were talking about the applicant overview section of eGrants, you will be asked to describe kind of your experience and capability and capacity to coordinate these kinds of efforts. Because again, if you are the applicant, we are assuming that you are going to be the lead agency or organization coordinating the project. So, in addition to what Chris just mentioned, would just consider that as well.
Awesome. Thank you both. We do have one last question in about 5 more minutes. So if anybody has any other questions that they want to get in there quickly, I suggest putting them in now. But our last question as of now is the VIP application. There's an initial component where you apply through SurveyMonkey. Is that a similar first step for CCVI, or will it just be through eGrants?
Yeah, so this is a purely eGrants funding announcement. So the person asking that is correct. With our VIP funding announcement, that is a 2-phased application process where it starts with a SurveyMonkey initial request form. And then if you're selected and invited to, you would submit a formal eGrants application at a later date. So this entire funding announcement for the Coordinated CVI Strategies Pilot Grant Program is eGrants start to finish. So that's why, if you're newer to the eGrant system, that information that Heather presented earlier, definitely make sure that you're registered for that system, because it is going to be where you develop and ultimately submit your application for funding. And if you're awarded, it would also be the system that you need to manage your grant award.
All right, well, thank you. Sam, I think that's all the questions that we have for now.
All right. Well, as we said before, if you do have more questions, please feel free to email us, and we do appreciate the questions that were asked and all of your participation in today's webinar session. As we mentioned before, a copy of the PowerPoint that we walked through today will be available on our website along with a recording from our webinar. And so we will notify everyone who's registered as soon as that information becomes available to view and download. We do encourage you to check out the additional information and resources that are listed on this slide to learn more about the CCVI funding opportunity, as well as PCCD's other programs and resources. And if you have any questions, again, send an email to our staff. The email address is listed there, but just again, ra-pccd_executiveofc@pa.gov. We will review inquiries and post answers to questions we receive, again, before the funding announcement closes on October 31st. So without further ado, thanks for your time. Thanks for the work you're doing. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Talk to you soon.